On December 17, 1940-4, the frozen soil of the Ardennes Forest crunched sickeningly beneath German. -15-degree winds carried fine snow pellets through the dense spines, stinging every face they touched like needles. Oberfeldklaus Dietrich stood at the edge of a devastated battlefield, his gaze sweeping over the captured American soldiers. Their breath condensed into white smoke in the biting Belgian morning fog, their hands bound behind their backs, huddled. But what made Dietrich stop in his tracks was not the dejected prisoners, but the objects scattered across the mud and snow. Small rectangular boxes printed with unfamiliar letters spread across the forest clearing like discarded toys, drawing K-rations, the field rations from an army they considered weak and soft, now scattered across this frozen battlefield. Dietrich bent down and picked up a box, the contents rattling softly inside, the sound unusually clear in the silent forest. At 40-2, he had led his troops through 3 years of increasingly desperate warfare, marching from victory to the edge. From the lightning advance through France to the bloody attrition on the Eastern Front, and now this desperate Ardennes. His gaunt frame and the hollow cheeks of his men were living evidence of months of dwindling supplies and increasingly. German iron rations had been cut to just 300 grams of canned meat and 120-5 grams of hard bread. On the Eastern Front, soldiers had resorted to boiling horse, hide and tree bark to fill their empty stomachs, a measure of. During the winter of 1940-3, when the 6th Army was encircled at Stalingrad, the final rations dropped too. Many soldiers survived those last days by boiling leather belts and gnawing on tree roots, the survivors who returned from. As if their souls had been consumed along with their hunger. Yet here before him, the enemy's rations seemed extravagantly. Dietrich held the K-ration box up to his adjutant Werner Kruger, a smirk on his lips, saying the Americans even package. Pretty boxes for pretty soldiers. The surrounding officers let out bitter laughs that echoed through the pine forest. They had been raised on the belief that Americans were worse off, that their army was nothing more than workers and farmers. These rations seemed to confirm their prejudice. How could an army that carefully packaged its rations possibly understand? Yet Dietrich and his men could never have imagined that what they held in their hands was the physical embodiment of the K-ration was not just food. It was a declaration of American industrial supremacy, a challenge issued by a young nation. Its designer was Ancel Keys, a physiologist at the University of Minnesota, a scholar who had never set foot in a military. Keys was a researcher obsessed with the limits of the human body. He had conducted the famous Minnesota Starvation. 30-6 volunteers underwent 6 months of semi-starvation under strictly controlled conditions to study the human body. The results were shocking. Subjects experienced dramatic weight loss and severe psychological changes, including depression. Some even began scavenging through garbage for scraps. It was precisely this research that gave him a profound understanding. He knew better than anyone that a hungry soldier was not merely physically weak. His judgment, willpower, and fighting. In 1940-1, when the United States Army came to Keys, they made a seemingly simple yet unprecedented request. Design a ration that could keep soldiers at peak physical performance under combat conditions, and it had to be compact. No army had ever attempted such a design before, compressing an entire day's worth of nutrition into a box that could fit in. Military ration design across all nations followed traditional thinking: large pot cooking, centralized distribution. Soldiers could not always sit in a mess hall to eat. They needed to replenish energy at any moment in the gaps between. Keys accepted the challenge. His team conducted thousands of experiments, testing every nutritional ratio with meticulous. They studied food preservation under different temperatures and humidity levels, and precisely calculated how many calories. They tested dozens of meat preservation methods, compared the effects of different fat contents on shelf life, and studied. They even considered how packaging materials affected food taste. The K-ration that emerged was precisely calculated in, containing meat, cheese, biscuits, chocolate, coffee, sugar, gum, cigarettes, and even toilet paper and matches. This was but a perfectly functioning nutritional machine. Every calorie had its purpose. Every gram of weight was deliberated. The breakfast box provided quick minus, release energy for morning marches, and the dinner box provided sustained calories for. The supper box contained high minus protein foods to aid nighttime recovery. Together, the three boxes weighed less than 1. Yet they provided over 3,000 calories, enough to sustain an adult male through an entire day of intense physical. When Dietrich finally opened the box he had mocked, he froze. The neatly arranged items inside far exceeded his expectations. He picked up a piece of chocolate, tore open the foil wrapper, and placed it in his mouth. In that moment, something broke. The chocolate melted slowly on his tongue, sweetness and cocoa bitterness intertwining, bringing a long minus, forgotten taste. This chocolate was not a luxury item, not a reward for special occasions. It was the daily ration of an American soldier. Meanwhile, his men were gnawing on moldy hard bread and nauseantly salty canned meat. Some soldiers had gone 3 days. Dietrich chewed the chocolate slowly as a chilling realization took shape in his mind. If even ordinary soldiers' rations. What terrifying level had this nation's industrial capacity reached? He picked up the coffee powder and inhaled its rich. In the German army, real coffee had long become legend. Soldiers drank substitutes made from ground acorns and chicory root. But in American rations, coffee was standard issue. Not a substitute, not inferior beans, but genuine Arabica coffee. Dietrich handed the coffee powder to Kruger. They locked eyes, needing no words, and their gaze was something deeper than. They were beginning to realize that the nature of this war was far different from what they had understood. Germany's war. Every bulletin, every ration was calculated to the limit. But America's war machine operated on an entirely different. Not barely enough, but more than enough. Not scraping by, but supplying with ease. This difference was not accidental. It was rooted in the fundamentally different industrial DNA of the two nations. In 1940-2, when America fully. Detroit's automobile factories began producing tanks and bombers. Chicago's meatpacking plants shifted to military supply. The Hershey Company produced 500,000 military chocolate bars daily. Swift Company output millions of cans of. Ford's Willow Run plant produced B-20- for bombers at a rate of 1 per hour, and by 1940-4, America was 100 million. That number made Dietrich feel like he was suffocating. Germany had never reached such production. Even more despairing was the fact that K-minus rations were merely the tip of the iceberg of the American logistics system. Liberty ships sailed from American ports, one after another, each loaded with enough supplies to sustain tens of thousands of. These ships were themselves industrial miracles, taking only 40-2 days from keel laying to launch, with the fastest. Even facing the German submarine Wolf-Pack tactics, American shipbuilding speed far outpaced the rate of sinking s. During the darkest period of 1940-3, German submarines sank hundreds of thousands of tons of Allied shipping. Admiral Dune and his submarine fleet ultimately admitted that they could never sink Allied ships faster than America could build. On land, America's logistics capabilities were equally staggering. In August 1940-4, the Red Ball Express. Over 6,000 trucks ran day and night between Normandy and the front lines, transporting more than 12,000 tons. This supply line was so efficient that American soldiers at the front never had to slow their advance due to supply. The German General Staff's operational logs recorded a fact that baffled them: the speed of the American advance in France. This was unimaginable in German military experience. Any army's advance speed should outpace its supply line extension. But the Americans seemed to have broken this law. Their trucks and aircraft allowed supply lines to keep pace with combat. Dietrich recalled an intelligence report he had received the previous winter. The report showed that an American infantry while a comparably sized German division needed only 8. At the time, he and his colleagues had scoffed at this. Now he understood. That was not waste. It was a way of war they had never comprehended. American soldiers were not only. They had fresh bread, ice cream, cola, and even mail-in packages from military postal workers. This was unimaginable. In the jungles of the Pacific, the deserts of North Africa, and the mountains of Italy, when American soldiers opened there. This was not merely logistics. It was the projection of a civilization's power, a declaration to the entire world that they... Dietrich carefully examined every item in the K-Ration. The quality of the canned meat far exceeded German standard rations. The rich aroma of cheese made his stomach growl involuntarily. And at chocolate, he picked it up again, examining it. Hershey military chocolate, made for the armed forces, was more heat-minus resistant than civilian versions and less apt to melt. Each bar contained 600 calories, enough to sustain a soldier through hours of combat. Meanwhile, Kruger had already. He took out a pack of cigarettes that one inhaled deeply, his expression complex, a mixture of satisfaction and... In the German army, tobacco allocations had been cut from 6 cigarettes per day to 3, and eventually stopped entirely. Germany was losing this war not because of insufficient courage, not because of tactical errors, and not even because of... Germans believed war was a contest of will, a trial of iron blood and discipline. They had meticulously crafted a precision. Every component was repeatedly refined, every process pursued ultimate efficiency. But Americans answered the question of... They did not pursue ultimate efficiency. They pursued ultimate production capacity. They did not need every component to be. They did not need every supply line to be foolproof, because they had enough ships and trucks to compensate for any losses. German Eiger tank was the most sophisticated war machine of its era, each requiring hundreds of thousands of man-minus hours. But precisely because of this, Germany produced only about 1,300 Tiger tanks during the entire war, while on the battlefield, one Tiger could destroy 3 Shermans, but the 4th Sherman would always appear, and the Tiger would. It was not the most refined military ration or the most delicious food, but it was a ration that could be produced on a... When German soldiers at Stalingrad gnawed on bread frozen hard as stone, when Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal wasted away, this gap was not accidental. It was a fundamental difference between 2 civilizations, 2 systems, 2 ways of thinking. One was a military tradition built on scarcity, where every grain was treated as a precious strategic resource and every. The other was an industrial civilization built on abundance, where every grain was just another product on the assembly line. Dietrich set down the empty K-Ration box, his hands trembling slightly, not from the cold, but from a realization that... He turned to Kruger, his voice hoarse. "We have been fighting the wrong thing." Kruger looked at him uncomrefontied. Dietrich continued, "We thought we were fighting an army, but in reality, we are fighting an entire industrial civilization. An army where even ordinary soldiers can eat chocolate and drink coffee every day cannot be defeated by courage alone. We cannot beat such an opponent because our conditions for victory are built upon their failure, and they simply do not have." These words hung heavy in the cold forest. The surrounding officers fell silent, each digesting this disturbing truth. Those pretty boxes they had once mocked now looked like a mirror, reflecting the fatal flaw in their own war machine. Kruger remained silent for a long time before finally speaking. "We always believed that war was won through willpower. But now, it seems we were wrong from the very beginning." Dietrich nodded, gazing at the captured American soldiers in the... Though their hands were bound, their faces lacked the despair and numbness commonly seen in German prisoners of war, as if they knew that no matter what happened, their country would not abandon them, would not let them go hungry, would not. This sense of security was a luxury German soldiers had never possessed. If a soldier knows his country cares whether he is. Dietrich suddenly understood a question he had never considered. American soldiers fought bravely not because they were born, but because behind them stood a nation that freed them from worry. German soldiers, however, found it increasingly difficult, not only because of the deteriorating war situation, but because they knew that even if they gave their all, their country. That night, Dietrich wrote a report that was later captured and translated by the Allies. The report stated that they were not confronting a traditional army, but an entirely new form of warfare. In this kind of war, logistics was nada. Factories and farms were as important as the front lines, perhaps more so. America's industrial capacity was not the. They had thought American surplus was waste, but that was precisely their most terrifying weapon, one they could never. The K-Ration ultimately became a revelation, not a revelation about American weakness, but about American strength. An army that could feed its troops so well that chocolate and coffee became daily staples rather than luxuries. Those German. Something unprecedented in military history. An army that truly never went hungry, backed by a nation that could produce. The war would continue for 3 more months after Dietrich wrote his report, but the psychological victory had already been